friends. Today we're going to talk about Rome and their conquest of Britain and the different contributions that they had to British society and civilization. I hope you'll find it very interesting. And I'm going to get into a little map tracing here in just a moment as we talk about some of the prehistory. So I hope you enjoy. Sit back and relax. So Britain, prior to Rome's arrival, was in an Iron Age. There were complex societies capable of managing resources. Case in point is the rather obvious Stonehenge, which I'll flash up a picture. There are also stone circles in other places, such as the Callanish standing stones. Early European references to Britain. Ancient Greeks called Britain Albion, which means white, likely due to the white cliffs of Dover. Greek explorer Pytheas of Massilia was the first written record of a European that sailed to Britain. He was thought to have been there about 325 BC. There was not much reported to the civilized world about Britain at that time. The general consensus was that they saw Britain as a barbarous land. Adding to that sensationalism was the difficulty of getting there due to the rough waters around what is now called the English Channel. One of the most advanced pre-Roman civilizations was in the city of Dorset. Here is an artist's rendering of Maiden Castle. This was what was known as a hill fort. It was rather effective defensively, at least for invaders prior to Rome. In about 60 BC, Julius Caesar had formed the first triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus. This trinity of leadership was very much a dictatorship, with each of the three men becoming suspect of the other ones getting too much power. Caesar had by this time already gained territory in southern Gaul, which is now France. Some of the territory had become threatened, but Caesar made a calculated decision to invade Britain. This was in hopes of gaining military momentum by taking additional territory. So in 55 BC, Caesar sent 2 legions and a cavalry to Britain. His attack was not successful due to a storm coming that damaged his fleet, so he returned to Gaul to lick his wounds. The following year, Caesar decided to attempt another invasion. The Britons were made up of different tribes that typically fought each other, but by the time Caesar made his second invasion, many of the British tribes became united under a tribal king named Cassivellaunus. While this was trouble for Caesar, he was saved when Mandubracius, a sworn enemy of Cassivellaunus, sided with Caesar. This new ally was invaluable to Caesar as he received intelligence on Cassivellaunus and the Britons. Rome by this time had established a coastal base. Cassivellaunus mounted an offensive, but it failed. Caesar was victorious, although this did not bring about occupation of Britain. Caesar would return to Gaul, and his raid on Britain gave him a victory to help his fame. But long term, it was not a victory that brought Roman occupation. That would come later. But it was important because it established a relationship as well as a fear of Rome for the tribes of Britain. It's important to note that the tribes of Britain would eventually go back and forth in both their infighting and their opposition to Rome. And at times they would ask for Rome for help, with varying results. I mention that only to identify that there were politics which eventually made invasion of Britain easier for Rome, as their allies were more numerous than one might think. By AD 41, Claudius was the new Roman emperor. He was the 4th Roman emperor after Augustus, Tiberius, and Caligula. One of the allies of Caligula, a British king named Boudicca, had fled Britain due to being defeated by another British tribe. Claudius used this event as a pretext to invade Britain to help his ally. Secretly, though, Claudius saw Britain as a way to solidify his hold on power as Roman emperor. He could expand the territory of Rome and exploit the Britons and simultaneously prove his mettle. The thinking, too, was they could appear as benevolent by civilizing an area seen around the known world as uncivilized. The most powerful British king offering resistance to Rome was Cunobelinus, a king that controlled the land north of the Thames River. He had expelled his son Adenius from Britain, who had become too powerful. In response, Adenius went to Rome for help. So once again, we see how there were several factions within Britain that were eager to bring Rome in. Rome, in some respect, had opportunities to subvert Britain. Ultimately, Cunobelinus died, and Rome saw this as an opportunity to hit Britain hard while they were weak. So in AD 43, the Roman fleet arrived in Britain. By this time, some parts of the southern Britain civilizations had already taken on aspects of Roman civilization, such as the use of coins and literacy. Here is a gold coin that Cunobelinus' British tribe had casted. Meanwhile, one of the tribal leaders, Caradicus, fled with his army into the western part of Britain near Wales. But Rome continued its attempt to subjugate Britain. It captured the crown jewel of the British military installations, Maiden Castle, located near Dorset. This was primarily led by Vespasian, a Roman general and a future emperor. Also, around this time, Rome built the Fosse Way, a road running from Exeter to Lincolnshire. This allowed for better movement of troops and resources. By 47 AD, southern Britain had, for all practical purposes, become a Roman province, as most of the resistance had retreated into other places or capitulated. Caradicus, though still in Wales, was hoping to organize resistance there. This was actually much easier in Wales, as there was no previous exposure to Roman civilization and the spoils and luxuries that come with it. The Welsh only knew that a foreign power was invading. While this was a successful resistance at first, eventually Caradicus and the Welsh were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of Romans and their southern Britain allies. Claudius erected an arch in Rome celebrating this victory. There's a part of the Arch of Rome that still survives. Here is a picture with the inscription referring to the submission of 11 British kings and bringing the barbaric tribes beyond the ocean into submission. By AD 54, Claudius had died and Nero ascended as emperor. Nero put Gaius Paulinus in charge of Britain. He continued the previous Roman campaigns of subjugation. So, as we're kind of winding down the map tracing part of the video, I'm going to start showing different cities that Rome founded and built within the island of Britain, and then we're going to get into more specifics on the history. We also have an interesting part coming up with the famous Queen Boudica. I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy that part as well. So keep in mind that there are many more Roman cities other than the ones that you see here, and I'm going to kind of show you an overall picture of it once we complete this, but I'm going to start with sort of the high points that I'm going to bring out in my narrative today. So first off, this is a city called Isca or Exeter. And we also have Aquasolis, or Bath as it's called in Britain. And then we have Stonehenge, which of course predates Roman times. And Maiden Castle in Dorset, or Maiden Castle as we say in the United States, which also predates Roman times. So first we have, in the east, we have Londinium or London, which of course was a major thing that Rome founded and was important strategically because of the Thames River. And going to get into a little bit of that in a moment. But Camulodunum, or Colchester, that was also a fort. These are not cities, but these are specific tribes. We're going to talk about in a moment the Trinovantes and the all-important Iceni, which is the tribe that Queen Boudica came out of. And we're going to get into plenty of specifics on that in just a moment. Lindum Colonia, or Lincoln. Back to the western part, here's Anglesey, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And Segedunum, or Wall's End, which we're going to get into Hadrian's Wall later, and that's a very important part of that narrative about Hadrian's Wall. And Mons Graupius, which is the site of a major battle that I will get into later. Finally, I want to bring out Callanish up here. It's the site of standing stones, and I wanted to bring that out because you can see this is the northern reaches of the British Isles right here, and they actually had stones similar to Stonehenge up here. So I'm going to flash up a picture of those. So you've got the Callanish standing stones, and then way down here in the south, you've got Stonehenge. So that's some very interesting that you had pre-Roman pieces of civilization. We're going to kind of pick up where we left off a little earlier. By AD 54, Claudius had died, and Nero had ascended as emperor. Nero put Gaius Paulinus in charge of Britain. Paulinus continued the previous Roman campaigns of subjugation, but one of the major pockets of resistance was the island of Anglesey, which is over here, right off the coast of Wales. They were controlled by a Druidic tribe. These Druids were unlike most Welsh at the time because they were literate, but also used some subterfuge in an attempt to intimidate the Romans. As the Roman soldiers crossed over into Anglesey, the Druids started using Wiccan incantations as a theatrical display. The Romans were absolutely terrified of this, as these incantations worked up a mob of Anglesey women and armed men. But Paulinus managed to reorganize his legion, and they routed the Anglesey mob and destroyed the Druidic groves. The Romans now controlled North Wales, but this would be a strategic nightmare. Because now the army is concentrated up here in the northern part of Wales, and then parts of the south and the east of Britain were left wide open. This led to the rise of the Romans' most formidable opponent. That would be the Iceni. So for a moment, I'm going to digress into talking about the Iceni and their most famous heroine, Queen Boudica. So I sort of mentioned how the Iceni earlier are located in this part of Britain right here. And then there's another tribe, the Trinovantes, which were south of there. So the story of Boudicca begins with Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, who made an agreement to ally with Nero. In return, Nero allowed him to remain in power as king of the Iceni, but he was required to pay tribute and essentially do Rome's bidding. The Iceni kingdom was wealthy and had access to gold. Prasutagus continued the arrangement with Rome until his death, and named Nero and his daughters as heirs of Iceni. Interestingly enough, Prasutagus left his wife Boudicca out of his will. Some speculate that Boudicca may have been anti-Roman even before her husband's death, which could have led to her exclusion from the will. But after Prasutagus' death, Rome did not treat the Iceni and their new rulers well. Rome's centurions plundered the gold of the Iceni and flogged Queen Boudica. This angered Boudicca's daughters, who were essentially made slaves and raped. Boudicca fled south to the Trinovantes, who were another pocket of tribes who were resistant to Rome. Boudicca raised an army. After she raised this army, Boudicca decided to go straight for the throat punch. The Romans were still trying to subjugate the Druids in Anglesey. Paulinus wouldn't hear about Boudicca's attack on the Romans for weeks. So Boudicca, coming from East Anglia, wiped out Roman settlement after Roman settlement. The crown jewel that Boudicca had in mind were the two Roman strongholds, and that would be Kendaldunum, which is now Colchester, and of course Londinium, which is now London. Some estimates of her forces suggest that it could have been as many as 200,000 men, though many historians believe that number to be on the high side. Colchester was the first to fall, as that garrison was only guarded by 200 Roman troops. Boudicca burned the settlement to the ground, and then turned her attention to London. And after attacking London, she burned that to the ground as well. But Paulinus had organized his full army by this time and was ready to meet Boudicca. Boudicca's army, while in greater numbers, were not equipped with anything remotely resembling the advanced weaponry of the Romans. Boudicca and the rebels were defeated by Paulinus. Boudicca is said to have committed suicide or to have grown ill and died, depending on the account. But Boudicca's story is one that has been inspiring for our modern world, as she was a powerful woman who went against the patriarchal grain of her day. Boudicca's revolt would be the last to rebel against Britain, at least in the southern part, as Rome would be more efficient with their subjugation as time went by. After the Boudiccan revolt, Paulinus was withdrawn from Britain. Rome was careful for a while not to do anything to cause any kind of revolt in Britain, but they did expand their power northward, and that became more of a trend once they consolidated their power in the south and also in Wales. In 68 AD, after Nero committed suicide, there was a power vacuum and a civil war, ultimately leading to Vespasian ascending to the Roman throne in 69 AD. Eventually, Agricola became governor of Britain, and he was tasked with subjugating the northern tribes of Britain. As Agricola and his army moved north, there was a pattern of victory over those tribes, followed by building forts as they went. This eventually continued north into what is now modern-day Scotland, and the forts there were established near places like Edinburgh. By this time, Domitian had ascended to the Roman throne. So as the subjugation of southern Scotland continued, the Caledonians, as I will call them, offered a great amount of resistance. In 83 AD, Agricola sent an army up to Mons Graupius. So while I have marked Mons Graupius on the map, note that the location of this is uncertain, but it's believed to have been somewhere between south of modern-day Inverness, Scotland. The belief is that Agricola had made enemies of the Caledonians by taking liberties with their granaries. This left them no choice because they would starve the next winter without grain stores. About 20,000 Roman and British allies faced about 30,000 Caledonians. The actual Roman legion was held in reserve. This was a huge victory for the Romans. However, the amount of resistance made Domitian wonder if the Romans should hold on to their present gains rather than heading further north. Matters were complicated further because of the German land around the Rhine and Danube was increasingly in danger of being lost for Rome, which would leave Rome vulnerable. So many of the forces in Scotland had been withdrawn as the 1st century AD turned into the 2nd. The Romans had consolidated power and subjugated most of Britain. The cultures of these British towns became distinctly Roman during this time. By 117, after ascending to the throne, the Emperor Hadrian decided that the previous issues subjugating Scotland were becoming too costly. As Hadrian was frustrated with the difficulty of his forces being unevenly distributed through Britain, he decided to build a wall. While the wall as seen in this picture of wall ruins was far from impenetrable, it did present a barrier to the movement for Rome's enemies. By 130 AD, Hadrian had died. The wall continued to be built after his death. It is thought to have been mostly completed by the late 2nd century. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of trace out the wall and its location. So Hadrian's Wall started about right here, and it went all the way here to a town called Segedunum, or Wall's End. So here is Hadrian's Wall. Meanwhile, the Britannia province extended into more northern reaches of Scotland, and then they decided to build a second wall. And this was called Antonines Wall. It was not used for very long, however, because the Romans would eventually go back to using Hadrian's Wall as their border started changing when the Picts migrated south, and as the Roman concentration of soldiers in the north became diluted due to other military needs throughout the empire at large. So now I'm going to show you Antonines Wall, approximate location. I just drew it there. So we have Antonines Wall right here, and we have Hadrian's Wall here. Pulling back to Hadrian's Wall essentially meant that southern Scotland was no longer under Roman control, although there did continue to be some outposts and forts that contributed to the stability of northern Britannia at large. Going to take a moment using a source that I have on Roman Britain and talk about specific Roman elements in Britain. So here's the source that I used for most of what I've discussed today, and I'm going to show you some specific aspects of Roman Britain culture and civilization. So here's an artist's rendering of a basilica and forum that was built in St. Albans in the 2nd century. The members of the town council, likely made up of aristocracy, met here to govern local affairs within a Roman framework. So this is at Tower Hill in London. Here is an example of a Roman wall that was built around the borders of old Roman Londinium. Such is the case here. When medieval walls were often built, they would use old existing Roman walls, or possibly the stone, to build on top of the old Roman ruin. This is Wall's End, or as it was called, Segedunum. This is an artist's rendering of the Segedunum fort. You can clearly see Hadrian's Wall that's connecting into the fort. This was on the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall, and a very strategic fort for Roman Britannia. Here is a modern reconstruction of a Roman granary located in Warwickshire. This is an artist's rendering of the Governor's Fort in London. It housed the garrison of the governor and other Roman armies as needed. This is a modern replica of an Arbia courtyard house. This was a 4th century courtyard house. Note the Mediterranean designs that would be uncommon anytime post-Roman in Britain. And last but not least, we're going to talk about the Roman baths or boths. And I'm going to read this couple of pages here that talks about the Roman baths. Bath is the most remarkable Roman site in Britain and was known to the Romans as Aquae Sulis, the waters of Sulis, and Aquae Collida, or hot springs. The settlement had no former status, but it did have some of the most extravagant architecture in the province and one of the most cosmopolitan populations. The centerpiece dominating the town was a massive temple and baths complex that surrounded the sacred hot water spring of the local deity Sulis, conflated with classical Minerva. Sulis Minerva is attested on numerous inscriptions and curse tablets found in and around the complex. Bath lies on the Fosse Way laid down by Roman armies in late 40s. A fort is likely to have been established here early on, but to date only auxiliary cavalry tombstones substantiate this. There seems to have been no native settlement or any kind of physical shrine. By the late 1st century, engineering and structural work had begun to convert the site into a full-scale religious healing and leisure complex. The spring was contained within a wall to create a pool, with the overflow channeled into the river Avon. The spring became the central feature of the temple precinct. Nearby was the altar, where sacrifices and offerings were made, overlooked by the temple of Sulis Minerva, which much has survived. Early 4th century, the vault had caused the building to begin collapsing, and it was reinforced with buttresses. The new buttresses created an architectural facade that overlooked the altar and was mirrored by an architectural screen on the other side. One of the curse tablets found at Bath shows that there was certainly a temple to Mars in the vicinity. Curved architectural fragments show that either a theater or round classical temple of Greek origin stood nearby. Curiously, for a place that must have had a reputation as a healing cult, there's little or no evidence from the various inscriptions that have been found. Perhaps the most interesting is the rededication by the centurion of the region, Gaius Severius Emeritus, of a sacred spot after it had been wrecked by insolent hands. Bath, it seems, has also attracted rowdy pleasure seekers, a reminder that the healing cults of the Roman Empire were also plagued by quacks and charlatans, only happy to relieve the gullible and sick of their funds. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that the temple in Bath's complex matured into what once must have been one of the most beautiful places in Roman Britain. The spring in the end would be its undoing, and also its preservation. As Roman Britain decayed, and as Christianity supplanted paganism, maintenance evaporated. The pool silted up and overflowed, and the site became awash with mud. The buildings themselves eventually collapsed into the mire, from which so much has been recovered from the 18th century to the present day. So now we're going to kind of have our finish and talk about later Roman Britannia in the end. By 177, problems in the northern part of Britain had escalated. As mentioned, the Romans had already concentrated their forces south of Hadrian's Wall, about right here. By the 3rd century, more military fortifications had been built around towns. This provided more stability, which happened across Britannia at large, but along the northern frontier especially. In the south, this time was a bit of a golden age. The wealthy aristocratic class became more pronounced at this time and spent more money on themselves. Wealthy villas became common. By about 260 to about 273, the separatist Gallic Empire broke away from Rome. Britain was included as part of the separatist movement, but Emperor Constantius I recaptured Britain by 296 AD. In 306 AD, Emperor Constantius I waged a campaign against the Picts and was killed. In York, his son Constantine I was declared Emperor of Rome. By 312, Christianity was adopted as the state religion after Constantine I came into power. By the 400s, no more Roman soldiers were sent to Britannia, as they were deemed necessary to defend Roman interests in Italy. In 449, the beginnings of the Anglo-Saxon invasions happened. While Britain continued a Roman way of life for a longer period after this, the towns fell into ruin without proper maintenance. Buildings and towns that fell into disrepair or burned down due to fire were not rebuilt, and thus this would be the end of Roman Britain for all practical purposes. I appreciate your attention and thank you for joining me.